a forest ranger stumbled upon a hidden cave, sealed shut since 1945. Inside, he found an old, dusty trunk, and when he opened it, there was a wedding veil, love letters from a World War II soldier, and a teddy bear with a note that read, "For the child we never had, for the future we dreamed of. May someone find this and know that we loved." But when he discovered who hid it and why, he broke down in tears. Tell me in the comments if you want to hear the full story. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like gossamer curtains as Ranger Thomas McCarthy made his way through the dense forest of Whispering Pines National Park. His German Shepherd, Scout, bounded ahead with the enthusiasm of a dog who'd walked this trail 1,000 times but still found it endlessly fascinating. Thomas had been a forest ranger for nearly 20 years, and these woods had become more home to him than the small cabin he returned to each evening. It was late September, and the forest was in that transitional state between summer's lush green and autumn's golden decay. The air smelled of earth and decomposing leaves, that peculiar scent that signaled the changing of seasons. Thomas adjusted the straps of his backpack and checked his watch, 6:47 a.m. He was making good time on his regular patrol route, which covered the northwestern section of the park where hikers rarely ventured. Scout had stopped ahead on the trail, his ears perked forward in that particular way that meant he detected something unusual. Thomas had learned to trust his dog's instincts implicitly over their 8 years together. Scout wasn't looking at the trail ahead, but rather off to the left, into a particularly dense thicket of mountain laurel and wild rhododendron. "What is it, boy?" Thomas called, approaching his companion. Scout whined softly, his tail wagging slowly in that uncertain way that indicated both interest and caution. The dog moved into the undergrowth, and Thomas followed, pushing aside branches and stepping carefully over hidden roots. They'd gone perhaps 50 yards off the trail when Scout stopped at what appeared to be a natural rock formation, a tumble of moss-covered boulders piled against the hillside. But something was different here. Thomas had excellent spatial memory, an essential skill for a ranger, and he was certain he'd never noticed this particular rock formation before. As he examined it more closely, he realized why. The boulders had shifted. Recent heavy rains had caused a minor landslide, displacing several large rocks and revealing something that had been hidden for God only knew how long. Behind the displaced boulders was an opening. Not large, perhaps 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, but definitely an opening. A cave entrance. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. In 2 decades of ranging these woods, he'd mapped every significant geological feature, or so he'd thought. This was new, or rather, newly revealed. Scout approached the opening cautiously, sniffing the air that emanated from the darkness within. The dog didn't show signs of fear, which Thomas took as a good indication. If there were a bear or mountain lion denning inside, Scout would be far more agitated. Thomas pulled out his high-powered flashlight and crouched down, shining the beam into the opening. The light revealed that the entrance opened into a larger space beyond. This wasn't just a shallow depression, but an actual cave system. The walls were limestone, smoothed by millennia of water flow, suggesting this had once been part of an underground stream that had long since found another route. "Should we check it out, Scout?" Thomas asked, already knowing his answer. The regulations were clear. Any significant discovery in the park had to be reported and properly investigated. But Thomas was also practical. Before he called in a team, potentially causing a bureaucratic circus, he wanted to know if this was actually significant or just a minor cave that would be documented and forgotten. He retrieved a coil of rope from his pack, tied one end to a sturdy oak tree, and secured the other end to his belt. Basic spelunking safety. Always have a way back. He also pulled out his radio and, after a moment's hesitation, decided to at least log his location. "Base, this is Ranger McCarthy on the Northwest Trail. Coordinates." He checked his GPS unit. 43.7892 north, 79.4563 west. Investigating a possible cave opening. Radio, check in 30 minutes. The response crackled back. "Copy that, McCarthy. Be safe out there." Thomas got down on his hands and knees, flashlight in one hand and crawled through the opening. Scout followed without hesitation, his claws scraping against the stone. The passage was tight for about 6 feet, then suddenly opened into a chamber that took Thomas's breath away. He stood up, shining his light around, and found himself in a space roughly the size of a small bedroom. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like nature's chandeliers, and the walls glittered with mineral deposits. But it wasn't the geological features that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. Against the far wall, arranged with obvious deliberation, were objects that had no business being in a hidden cave in the middle of a national forest. His light fell upon what appeared to be an old wooden trunk, its surface covered in decades of dust and moisture damage. Next to it were several items wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, and beyond those, something that made Thomas's hands shake as he held the flashlight. A small child's teddy bear, remarkably well-preserved, sat propped against the cave wall, as if placed there by caring hands. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. This wasn't a natural cache or the random debris of recreational cavers. This was something else entirely, something that had been deliberately hidden and left for a very long time. Scout whined softly and moved toward the teddy bear, sniffing it carefully. The dog's behavior was odd, not aggressive or scared, but almost gentle, as if he sensed the significance of what they'd found. Thomas approached the trunk slowly, his mind racing through possibilities. Could this be evidence of a crime? A time capsule? Something left by early settlers? The trunk itself looked to be from the early to mid-20th century, judging by its construction and the type of metal fittings used. He knelt beside it, noticing that despite the dampness of the cave, the trunk had been positioned on several flat stones, keeping it elevated from the cave floor. Someone had taken great care in preserving whatever was inside. The clasp was corroded but not locked. Thomas hesitated. Should he open it? This could be evidence. This could be historically significant. This could be nothing. But the ranger in him, the part that had spent 20 years protecting and understanding these woods, needed to know. He took several photographs with his phone, documenting everything before he touched it. Then, carefully, he lifted the clasp. It resisted for a moment, then gave way with a soft click that echoed in the chamber. Thomas slowly opened the lid. Inside, protected by multiple layers of what appeared to be wax paper, were stacks of letters, all tied together with ribbon that had faded to a pale shadow of what must have once been read. Beneath the letters were photographs, black and white images of people from another era. Men in military uniforms from what looked like World War II. Women in the fashion of the 1940s. Children playing in yards with wooden toys. But it was what lay beneath these items that made Thomas's hands tremble and brought unexpected tears to his eyes. A journal, leather-bound, worn at the edges, with a name embossed in gold on the cover, still visible despite the years. Margaret Rose Sullivan, 1943. Thomas carefully lifted the journal from the trunk, his mind reeling. 1943, the middle of World War II. What was this woman's story? Why had someone hidden this trunk in a cave? And most puzzling of all, why had they included the teddy bear? Scout had settled beside him, the dog's warmth a comfort in the cool cave. Thomas opened the first page of the journal, shining his flashlight on the faded ink. The handwriting was elegant, the script of someone who'd been educated in a different time. June 3rd, 1943, the first entry began. Today I received the telegram I've been dreading. James is missing in action over France. They say there's still hope, but I know in my heart what those words really mean. I've decided to create this collection of our memories, all the letters he sent, all the photographs we took, everything that proves our love was real and mattered. If something should happen to me, I want someone, someday, to know that we existed, that our love existed, even if the war took us both. Thomas felt tears streaming down his face as he read the words. Here, in a hidden cave, was a time capsule of love and loss, hidden away by a woman who'd faced the very real possibility that both she and her soldier might not survive the war. He carefully placed the journal back in the trunk and looked at the other items. The packages wrapped in oilcloth revealed more treasures. A wedding veil, a military medal, what appeared to be a wedding ring in a small box, and more photographs. But the teddy bear, that small, carefully preserved teddy bear sitting against the wall, that's what broke him. Because attached to it, with a small tag that had somehow survived the decades, was a note in the same handwriting. For the child we hope to have, for the future we dreamed of. May someone find this and know that we loved, we hoped, and we existed. MRS, October 1945 October 1945. 2 months after the end of World War II. Thomas sat back against the cave wall, Scout pressing against his side. This wasn't just a historical discovery. It was a message in a bottle from the past, from a woman named Margaret Rose Sullivan, who had hidden away the most precious things in her life, knowing she might not be there to tell her own story. He looked at Scout, who gazed back with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand the weight of what they'd found. "We need to find out what happened to her, Scout," Thomas said softly. "We need to finish her story." As he sat in that hidden cave, surrounded by the echoes of a love story from 8 decades past, Thomas McCarthy knew that his life as a forest ranger had just become something more. He'd stumbled onto a mystery that demanded to be solved, a story that deserved to be told, and a promise that needed to be kept. Outside, the morning sun was climbing higher, burning off the mist and illuminating the forest in golden light. But inside the cave, time had stopped in 1945, waiting patiently for someone to find it and bring Margaret Rose Sullivan's story back to the light. Thomas spent the next hour carefully documenting everything in the cave. He took dozens of photographs from every angle, logged the GPS coordinates with precision, and made detailed notes in his ranger's log. Every artifact was photographed in situ before he allowed himself to examine it more closely. Years of training and natural respect for historical preservation kicked in. Whatever this was, it needed to be handled properly. The letters, when he carefully unfolded one to read, were arranged chronologically. He selected one from the middle of the stack, dated August 1943. "My dearest Margaret Rose, I'm writing this from somewhere I can't name, doing something I can't describe, but know that every moment away from you feels like a lifetime. I keep your photograph in my jacket pocket, right over my heart. The other men tease me about it, but I don't care. You're the reason I'll make it through this war. I dream about our future, the house we'll buy on Pine Street like we talked about, the garden you'll plant, the children we'll raise. 2, maybe 3 if we're blessed. I want a daughter first, with your beautiful dark hair and kind eyes. We'll name her after your mother, like you wanted. Stay strong, my love. This war can't last forever, and when it ends, I'm coming home to you. That's a promise. Forever yours. James." Thomas felt his throat tighten. James had written about coming home, about their future, about children. But the teddy bear remained here, and used, along with Margaret's note from October 1945. What had happened to them? He carefully photographed the letter and placed it back with the others. Then he turned his attention to the military medal he'd found. It was a Purple Heart, America's oldest military decoration, awarded to those wounded or killed in service. The name engraved on the back confirmed what Thomas had already suspected: Lieutenant James Michael Sullivan, United States Army Air Forces. The pieces of the story were coming together, but with each answer came more questions. If James had earned a Purple Heart, had he been wounded? Had he survived the war? And if Margaret had survived to hide this cache in October 1945, what had happened to her afterward? Thomas's radio crackled to life, startling both him and Scout. "McCarthy, this is Base. You're past your 30-minute check-in. Report status." Thomas pressed the transmit button. "Base, this is McCarthy. I'm secure. The cave is significant. Historical artifacts present. I'm going to need to extend my investigation and will require backup. Can you contact Chief Hartley and request he meet me at these coordinates? This is priority." There was a pause on the other end, then, "Copy that. Chief Hartley will be notified. ETA approximately 1 hour. Do you need any immediate assistance?" "Negative. I'm safe. Just need the chief to see this in person." McCarthy out. Thomas knew that calling in the park's chief ranger would set off a chain of events, documentation, possible involvement of historical societies, maybe even the media. But this discovery was too important to keep to himself, and he needed expertise beyond his own to handle it properly. He used the hour before Chief Hartley's arrival to explore the rest of the cave. The main chamber was the only significant space. There were no passages leading deeper into the earth, which explained why it had remained hidden so long. It was essentially a dead end, a single room carved by ancient water and sealed by the natural tumble of boulders outside. But as Thomas examined the walls more carefully, he noticed something else. Scratched into the limestone, barely visible, were more words in that same elegant script. Here lies our love, our dreams, our future. If you find this, please tell our story. Don't let us be forgotten. MRS. It was a plea from across 8 decades, a desperate hope that someone would discover this cave and honor the memories preserved within it. Thomas felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. Scout had curled up near the entrance, patient as always, occasionally lifting his head to check on Thomas. The dog's presence was a comfort, an anchor to the present while Thomas's mind wandered through the past. When Chief Hartley finally arrived, a tall, graying man in his late 50s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors, his reaction to the cave's contents was similar to Thomas's. The hardened ranger who'd seen everything the wilderness could throw at him stood in silence for a long moment, then removed his hat in a gesture of respect. "My God, McCarthy," he breathed, "you found something remarkable here." Together, they carefully cataloged everything. Chief Hartley had brought a proper evidence kit, not because they suspected any crime, but because he understood the historical significance of what they'd found. Each item was photographed, its position documented, and then carefully placed in archival-quality storage containers. "We'll need to contact the State Historical Society," Hartley said as they worked, "and probably the National Archives. If this Lieutenant Sullivan served in World War II, there will be records. We might be able to piece together what happened to him." Thomas nodded, handling a stack of photographs with gloved hands. Each image was a window into another time. Young people at dances, families gathered for dinners, James in his uniform looking impossibly young and hopeful, Margaret in her wedding dress, radiant with joy. "I want to know what happened to her," Thomas said quietly. Margaret Rose Sullivan. She went to all this trouble to preserve these memories, to create this monument to their love. "I want to know if she found happiness again, or if this cave holds the last remnants of a life destroyed by war." Hartley looked at his subordinate with new respect. "Then we'll find out. I'll make some calls. We have resources, park historians, contacts at various libraries and archives. If there's a story here, and clearly there is, we'll uncover it." They worked until early afternoon, carefully removing everything from the cave to protect it from further deterioration. The teddy bear was the last item Thomas picked up, and he held it gently, thinking about the child who was never born, the future that was never realized. Back at the ranger station, Chief Hartley made good on his promise. Within hours, he'd contacted the State Historical Society, the National Archives, and even the local library in the nearest town, Harrison Falls, which was about 30 miles from the park. Thomas, meanwhile, began his own investigation. Using the park's computer, he started searching for any information about Margaret Rose Sullivan and Lieutenant James Michael Sullivan. The surname was common, which complicated matters, but the combination of first names, the military service in World War II, and the time period narrowed things down. What he found in the military records brought both relief and heartbreak. Lieutenant James Michael Sullivan had indeed served in the United States Army Air Forces as a bomber pilot. He'd been shot down over France in May 1943, the telegram Margaret had mentioned in her journal. But here's where the story took an unexpected turn. James had survived. He'd been captured by the Germans and spent the rest of the war in a prisoner-of-war camp. He'd been liberated in April 1945 and returned to the United States in June of that year. Thomas leaned back in a chair, his mind racing. James had survived. He'd come home. So why had Margaret created this cache? Why the sorrowful tone of her note from October 1945, months after her husband's return? He dug deeper, searching local newspaper archives that had been digitized. And there, in a Harrison Falls Gazette from September 1945, he found another piece of the puzzle. Local war hero returns home to tragedy. The article described how Lieutenant James Sullivan had returned from the war to discover that his wife, Margaret Rose Sullivan, was dying of tuberculosis. She'd contracted the disease while volunteering at a military hospital during the war and had declined rapidly. She'd known she was dying when she created the cave cache. Thomas felt tears welling up again as he read the article. Margaret had hidden away their memories not because James was dead, but because she was dying. She'd wanted to preserve their love story, their dreams, their hopes for the future, including the child they'd never have, in a place where time couldn't touch it. But what had happened to James? Thomas searched further and found an obituary from 1947. James Michael Sullivan, 28, died peacefully on Tuesday at his home on Pine Street. A decorated veteran of World War II, Sullivan returned from the war to care for his ailing wife, Margaret Rose Sullivan, née Fletcher, who passed away in October 1945. Friends say Sullivan never recovered from the loss of his beloved wife. He is survived by his parents, Michael and Catherine Sullivan, and his sister, Eleanor Sullivan Bradshaw. They'd both died young, their dreams of a future together stolen by war and disease. But they lived long enough to create this remarkable testament to their love. Margaret had hidden it away, and James must have known about it. Perhaps he'd even helped her or approved of her decision to preserve their story this way. Thomas sat in the quiet ranger station, the weight of their story pressing down on him. Scout, sensing his distress, placed his head on Thomas's knee, offering silent comfort. Chief Hartley entered the office, carrying a cup of coffee. "You found something," he said, reading Thomas's expression. "I found their story," Thomas replied, "and it's breaking my heart." He shared what he'd learned, and Hartley listened in silence, his own eyes growing misty. "So they both died young," the chief said softly. "But they wanted their story preserved. They wanted to be remembered." "The sister," Thomas said suddenly, "Eleanor Sullivan Bradshaw. She might have had children, grandchildren. There might be family out there who'd want to know about this." Hartley nodded. "The Historical Society is already working on tracking down any living relatives. In the meantime, we need to decide what to do with the artifacts." Thomas looked at the carefully packed boxes containing Margaret and James's treasures. "We honor their wish. We tell their story. That's what Margaret asked for in her inscription. Please tell our story. Don't let us be forgotten." "Agreed," Hartley said. "I'll work with the Historical Society to create a proper exhibit. And McCarthy, you should be the one to write their story. You found them. You brought them back to the light." Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas McCarthy became as much a detective as a forest ranger. Every spare moment was spent researching Margaret and James Sullivan, piecing together the fragments of their lives from newspapers, military records, hospital archives, and interviews with the dwindling number of people in Harrison Falls who remembered them. What emerged was a love story that was both heartbreakingly ordinary and extraordinarily beautiful. Margaret Rose Fletcher had been a schoolteacher in Harrison Falls, known for her kindness and her love of literature. James Sullivan had been the son of a local shopkeeper, a young man with dreams of becoming an engineer. They'd met at a church social in 1940, married in 1941, and had exactly 18 months of married life before James enlisted after Pearl Harbor. The war had separated them, but their letters, those precious letters preserved in the cave, showed a love that remained vibrant despite the distance. Margaret had written to James every single day he was overseas, and he'd written back whenever he could. They'd made plans for their future, named their unborn children, sketched the garden they'd plant, chosen wallpaper patterns for the house they'd buy. Then came the telegram in May 1943. "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your husband, Lieutenant James M. Sullivan, has been reported missing in action over France." Margaret had lived with uncertainty for 2 years, not knowing if her husband was alive or dead. During that time, she'd volunteered at a military hospital, caring for wounded soldiers, trying to do something meaningful while she waited for news. That's where she'd contracted tuberculosis, though she hadn't known it at the time. When James was liberated in April 1945, Margaret finally received the news she'd been praying for. He was alive. He was coming home. But by then, She knew she was sick. The diagnosis had come in March 1945, advanced tuberculosis, almost certainly terminal. The disease had ravaged her lungs before she'd even recognized the symptoms. Thomas found a letter Margaret had written to her sister, Helen, in which she described her decision to create the cave cache. I want to give James something to hold on to when I'm gone. Not just the pain of loss, but a treasure chest of our love. I'll hide it in the cave we discovered on one of our hikes. Do you remember? The one we could never find again? It will be our secret place, and someday, when the world has forgotten us, someone will find it and know that we existed, that we mattered, that our love was real. The cave Thomas and Scout had discovered wasn't random. It was a place that had been special to Margaret and James, a spot they'd found on one of their hikes before the war. Margaret had managed to find it again, even in her weakening state, and had hidden away their treasures. But Thomas's research revealed something else, something that made the story even more poignant. James had known about the cave. In his own diary, found among his effects after his death, and now housed in the local library's archives, he'd written, June 10th, 1945, I found Margaret's secret today. She thinks I don't know, but I followed her into the woods. She was so weak but determined. She'd hidden away our memories in that cave we found on our honeymoon hike, the one we could never relocate afterward. She's preserved our love like a museum exhibit, like something precious and sacred. I didn't let her know I saw. This is her gift to me, her way of ensuring our love survives, even death. I'll let her have this. I'll let her believe our story will be found someday and told. It's the only hope that seems to ease her pain. Thomas cried when he read those words. James had known. He'd understood what Margaret was doing and why. And after her death in October 1945, he'd let the cave keep its secrets. He hadn't retrieved the items or revealed their location. He'd honored Margaret's vision of their love story being discovered by strangers in some distant future when they themselves had been forgotten. The research also revealed why James had died so young, just 2 years after Margaret. According to his medical records and the accounts of those who knew him, James had simply lost the will to live after Margaret's death. He'd survived 2 years in a POW camp, had endured bombings and deprivation, but he couldn't survive the loss of his wife. He'd wasted away from what doctors at the time called grief, but what modern medicine would recognize as severe depression. He'd died in the house on Pine Street they'd bought together, the house where they'd planned to raise their children. The trail of living relatives proved easier to follow than Thomas had expected. Eleanor Sullivan Bradshaw, James's sister, had indeed had children. Her daughter, Patricia, was still alive at age 78 and lived in a retirement community in Portland, Oregon. When Chief Hartley contacted her about the discovery, she'd been stunned. Aunt Margaret and Uncle James, she'd said over the phone, her voice trembling with emotion. I was only 6 when they both died, but I remember them. I remember how much they loved each other, and how sad Uncle James was when Aunt Margaret died. My mother, his sister, used to say that he died of a broken heart. Patricia agreed to fly to Harrison Falls for the official unveiling of the exhibit. The State Historical Society, working with the National Park Service, had moved quickly to create a proper display at the park's visitor center. They decided to call it Love in the Time of War, the Margaret and James Sullivan Collection. The exhibit opening was scheduled for a Saturday in mid-October, almost exactly 80 years after Margaret had hidden away her treasures. Thomas had spent the weeks leading up to the opening writing their story, compiling all his research into a narrative that would accompany the artifacts. On the morning of the opening, Thomas stood in the visitor center, looking at the exhibit he'd helped create. The letters were displayed behind glass, selected passages enlarged and printed on the walls. The photographs showed Margaret and James in happier times, young, in love, innocent of the tragedies that awaited them. The wedding veil was draped carefully on a mannequin, and James's military medals were displayed with honor. But the centerpiece of the exhibit was the teddy bear, sitting exactly as Thomas had found it in the cave, with Margaret's note beside it. For the child we hoped to have, for the future we dreamed of. May someone find this and know that we loved, we hoped, and we existed. MRS, October 1945 inch. Beside the bear was Thomas's own edition, a photograph of the cave entrance, and a placard that read, "This collection was discovered on September 18th, 2025, by Forest Ranger Thomas McCarthy and his K9 partner, Scout, in a hidden cave in Whispering Pines National Park." For 80 years, Margaret and James Sullivan's love story waited in the darkness, exactly as Margaret intended, preserved, protected, and ready to be told to a world that had forgotten them. This is their story. They existed. They loved. They mattered. The visitor center filled with people that morning, historians, reporters, local residents, and curious visitors who'd heard about the discovery. But the most important guest was Patricia Bradshaw, accompanied by her own daughter and 3 grandchildren. When Patricia saw the exhibit, she broke down in tears. "I have so little of them," she said to Thomas, clutching his hand. "A few photographs my mother saved, some stories passed down. But this is them. This is who they really were." Thomas found himself crying too as he watched Patricia examine the letters, touch the glass protecting her aunt's wedding veil, and read the journal entries that revealed Margaret's hopes and fears. Scout sat beside Thomas, as steady and comforting as always, and Thomas thought about the strange chain of events that had led to this moment. If it hadn't rained heavily that week, the landslide wouldn't have occurred. If Scout hadn't detected something unusual, they would have walked past. If Thomas had been less curious or more by the book, he might not have investigated. But somehow, after 80 years, the time had been right for Margaret and James's story to be discovered. During the official ceremony, Thomas was asked to speak. He stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, and spoke from the heart. "2 weeks ago, I was just doing my job, walking a trail I'd walked hundreds of times before. My dog Scout noticed something unusual, and we investigated. What we found changed my life and reminded me why I became a forest ranger in the first place. I've always loved these woods because they're timeless. Trees that have stood for centuries, stones shaped by millennia of rain and wind. In nature, we find perspective. We remember that we're part of something larger than ourselves, something that continues long after we're gone. But what Margaret Rose Sullivan taught me is that humans are part of that timelessness too. When we love deeply, when we create meaning, when we preserve what matters, we become part of that continuity. Margaret and James have been gone for nearly 80 years, but their love is here, right now, as real and powerful as it was in 1943. Margaret asked, in her inscription in the cave, that someone tell their story, that someone remember they existed. Today, we honor that request. We tell the world about a schoolteacher and a soldier who loved each other deeply, who dreamed of a future together, and who found a way to make their love immortal. They existed. They loved. They mattered. And thanks to Margaret's foresight and a bit of luck, their story will continue to be told for generations to come. The applause was warm and genuine, and Thomas stepped down from the podium, feeling like he'd fulfilled his sacred duty. Patricia approached him afterward, along with her family. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for finding them, for caring enough to research their story, for giving my family this gift. I'm going to make sure my grandchildren know about Margaret and James, that their story stays alive." As the crowd dispersed and people examined the exhibit, Thomas slipped outside with Scout. The autumn afternoon was beautiful, the kind of day that made you glad to be alive. He sat on a bench outside the visitor center, and Scout lay at his feet. Chief Hartley joined them a few minutes later. "You did good, McCarthy. Really good. This is going to be one of the most visited exhibits in the park's history." Thomas nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Margaret in the final months of her life, making the difficult journey into the woods to hide away her treasures. He was thinking about James, following her in secret, understanding what she was doing and why, honoring her vision even after her death. "Do you believe in fate?" Thomas asked suddenly. Hartley considered the question. "I believe in being in the right place at the right time. I believe in paying attention to what the world is trying to tell you." "Why?" "I keep thinking about how this all happened. The timing of it. The fact that Scout noticed something I would have missed. The fact that I decided to investigate instead of just reporting it. It's like Margaret and James waited 80 years for exactly the right person to find them. Hartley smiled. Maybe they did. Maybe that's how these things work. Their story needed someone who would care, who would do the work to understand them, who would honor their wishes. They got you. Thomas looked down at Scout, who gazed back with those intelligent brown eyes. We found them together, didn't we, boy? Scout's tail thumped against the ground, his version of agreement. That evening, after the event had ended and the crowds had departed, Thomas drove back to the cave site. He hiked the trail as the sun set, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber. When he reached the spot where the cave entrance lay hidden behind the boulders, he stopped. The entrance had been carefully sealed after the artifacts were removed to preserve the site and prevent accidents. But Thomas could still picture how it had looked that morning 2 weeks ago when he and Scout had first discovered it. He'd brought something with him, a small bronze plaque that the Historical Society had made. With Chief Hartley's permission, he'd planned to mount it on a rock near the cave entrance. The plaque read, "Near this spot, Margaret Rose Sullivan, 1917 to 1945, created a time capsule of love and memory during the final months of her life. Her husband, Lieutenant James Michael Sullivan, 1917 to 1947, honored her vision. Their story, hidden for 80 years, reminds us that love transcends time, that memory is sacred, and that every life matters. Tell our story. Don't let us be forgotten. MRS." Thomas mounted the plaque carefully, making sure it was secure. It would weather over time, the bronze developing a patina, but it would last for decades, maybe centuries. Future hikers might stumble upon it and wonder about the story it referenced. Some might visit the exhibit. Others might simply pause and think about the love story it represented. As Thomas finished his work, the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, and for just a moment, he could imagine he saw them, Margaret and James, young and hopeful, hiking through these same woods on their honeymoon, discovering the cave that would later hold their memories. He could imagine them laughing, holding hands, making plans for a future that would be stolen from them but never truly lost. Scout pressed against his leg, and Thomas reached down to scratch his dog's ears. "We did it, Scout. We kept our promise. Their story will be told. They won't be forgotten." As he hiked back to his truck in the gathering darkness, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace. He'd been a forest ranger for 20 years, and he'd protected countless acres of wilderness, helped thousands of visitors, and preserved the natural beauty of these woods. But in 2 weeks, he'd done something more. He'd brought 2 people back from oblivion. He'd rescued a love story from the darkness and shared it with the world. He'd honored a dying woman's final wish and a grieving man's silent promise. In the weeks and months that followed, the exhibit drew visitors from around the country. News outlets picked up the story. A documentary filmmaker expressed interest in creating a film about Margaret and James. Several novelists reached out, asking permission to fictionalize their story. But for Thomas, the most meaningful response came in the form of a letter from Patricia Bradshaw's youngest granddaughter, a 16-year-old named Margaret Rose, named after her great-great-aunt, a woman she'd never known existed until Thomas found the cave. "Dear Ranger McCarthy," the letter began, "I wanted to thank you for finding my family's story. Before you discovered that cave, I was just a teenager named Margaret Rose, annoyed that my parents had given me such an old-fashioned name. Now I understand. Now I know I carry the name of a woman who loved deeply, who faced death with courage, and who believed that love could survive anything, even time itself. I'm a junior in high school, and I've been struggling with what I want to do with my life. But after learning about Margaret and James, I've decided. I want to be a teacher like Margaret was. I want to touch lives the way she did. And I want to love as bravely as she loved. Thank you for caring enough to tell their story. Thank you for making sure they weren't forgotten. Because of you, I know who I am and who I want to become. With gratitude, Margaret Rose Bradshaw." Thomas kept that letter in his desk drawer at the ranger station, taking it out whenever he needed to remember why his work mattered. Because it wasn't just about protecting trees and trails and wildlife, though those things were important. It was about protecting the stories that made us human, the connections that transcended time, the love that refused to be forgotten. 6 months after the discovery, On a crisp April morning, Thomas returned to the cave site with a special visitor. Patricia Bradshaw had requested one final pilgrimage to the place where her aunt and uncle's story had been preserved. Despite her age and the difficult hike, she'd insisted on making the journey. Thomas and Scout led her slowly through the forest, taking frequent breaks. Patricia leaned heavily on her walking stick, but her eyes were bright with determination. When they finally reached the spot, she stood silently for a long moment, reading the bronze plaque. She was only 28 when she died, Patricia said softly. Younger than my own granddaughter is now. So much life still to live, so many dreams unfulfilled. But she didn't waste her final months in bitterness or despair. She created something beautiful. She turned her tragedy into a gift. She must have been an extraordinary person, Thomas said. My mother, James's sister, used to say that Margaret had the biggest heart of anyone she'd ever known. She said Margaret believed that love was the only thing that really mattered, the only thing that lasted. Patricia reached out and touched the plaque gently. She was right. Look at us, standing here 80 years later, still talking about their love. It did last. She made sure it lasted. Patricia reached into her bag and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. I brought something, she said. I'd like to leave it here, if that's allowed. She unwrapped the tissue to reveal a photograph in a small frame. Margaret and James on their wedding day, looking impossibly young and radiantly happy. This is a copy of one of the photos you found in the cave. I thought they should have one photograph back here in their special place. Thomas felt his throat tighten. I think that's beautiful. And yes, it's allowed. Together, they found a small natural alcove in the rocks near the cave entrance, protected from the elements. Patricia placed the photograph there carefully, arranging it so that Margaret and James seemed to be looking out at the forest they'd loved. Rest in peace, Patricia whispered. Your story has been told. You haven't been forgotten. You never will be. As they made their way back down the trail, Patricia talked about her memories of James. He was gentle, she said. Even in his grief, even when he was clearly dying himself, he was kind to me. I remember him reading to me from the same books Margaret had loved. I remember him teaching me to identify wildflowers because Margaret had known all their names. He kept her alive through those small acts of remembrance. He loved her very much, Thomas said. He loved her beyond death, Patricia corrected. That's a rare thing. Most people, when they lose someone, eventually move on. They heal, they find new love. But James couldn't, or wouldn't. My mother used to worry about him, but I think he made a choice. He chose to keep loving Margaret even after she was gone. In a way, he chose her over life itself. They walked in silence for a while, Scout leading the way with his usual steady confidence. Then Patricia spoke again. Do you believe in heaven, Ranger McCarthy? Thomas considered the question. I believe in something. I'm not sure what to call it. But yes, I believe that love like Margaret and James's doesn't just end. It goes somewhere. It continues somehow. Patricia smiled. Good, because I like to think they're together now, wherever they are. Young again, healthy again, with all the time in the world to live out the dreams that were stolen from them. Maybe they have that daughter James wrote about, the one with Margaret's dark hair and kind eyes. Maybe they got their house and their garden and they're happily ever after, just not in this world. I hope so, Thomas said sincerely. When they finally reached the trailhead, Patricia turned to Thomas and took his hands in hers. Thank you, she said. Thank you for giving my family this gift, for giving the world this story, and for being the kind of person who cared enough to do all the work you did. You're a good man, Thomas McCarthy. I just did what Margaret asked, Thomas replied. I told their story. You did more than that, Patricia said firmly. You honored a promise made 80 years ago by a dying woman. You gave meaning to their suffering. You proved that love really can transcend time. That's no small thing. After Patricia left, Thomas and Scout sat in the parking area for a while, not quite ready to return to the routine of their regular duties. Thomas thought about everything that had happened since that September morning when they discovered the cave. The exhibit had become one of the most popular attractions in the park. Schools brought students to learn about World War II history and the power of primary sources. Couples came to read the love letters, and remember why they'd fallen in love with their own partners. Historians came to study the artifacts, and people from all walks of life came simply to stand in the presence of a love story so pure and enduring that it had survived 80 years in darkness. Thomas had been interviewed by newspapers and magazines. He'd given talks to historical societies and conservation groups. He'd even been invited to speak at a conference on the importance of preserving natural spaces, where he'd argued that places like Whispering Pines National Park weren't just important for their ecological value, but because they held stories, human stories that deserve to be discovered and told. But despite all the attention and accolades, what mattered most to Thomas was the simple fact that he'd kept a promise. Margaret Rose Sullivan had asked that someone tell her story, and he had done exactly that. She'd wanted the world to know that she and James had existed, had loved, had mattered, and now thousands of people knew. As spring turned to summer, and summer faded into autumn, life at Whispering Pines National Park returned to its normal rhythms. Thomas continued his patrols, maintained the trails, helped lost hikers, and educated visitors about leave no trace principles. But he was different now. He looked at the forest with new eyes, wondering what other stories might be hidden in its depths, what other messages from the past might be waiting to be discovered. On the one-year anniversary of finding the cave, Thomas returned to the site with Scout. The forest was dressed in the colors of early autumn, just as it had been when they'd made their discovery. The bronze plaque had already developed a slight patina, giving it an aged, permanent quality that seemed fitting. Thomas stood before the plaque and spoke aloud, even though there was no one to hear him but Scout. "Margaret, James, it's been a year. Your story has touched more lives than you could have imagined. People who never knew you have been moved to tears by your love. Couples have renewed their vows after reading your letters. Teachers have used your story to help students understand the human cost of war. You asked not to be forgotten, and I promise you, you haven't been. You won't be. Your love has become part of the history of this place, part of the story we tell about what it means to love completely, to hope courageously, and to face loss with grace. I don't know if you can hear me, wherever you are, but I want you to know that finding your story changed my life. It reminded me that every person matters, every love story is sacred, and every act of remembrance is an act of defiance against the forgetting that time brings. Thank you for trusting that someone would find your cave. Thank you for believing that your story mattered enough to preserve. You were right. It did matter. It still matters. It will always matter." Scout, as if understanding the solemnity of the moment, sat quietly beside Thomas, his warm presence a comfort. Together, they stood in the forest as the afternoon light filtered through the turning leaves, casting everything in gold. Thomas thought about Margaret making this same journey in her final months, carrying her precious cargo of memories, determined to create something that would outlast her short life. He thought about James, following behind in secret, understanding and honoring what she was doing. He thought about the 80 years that had passed, the countless hikers who had walked past this spot without knowing what lay hidden just yards away. And he thought about Scout, the faithful companion whose keen senses had detected something unusual that September morning, setting in motion a chain of events that had brought two people back from oblivion. "Good dog," Thomas said softly, reaching down to scratch Scout's ears. "The best dog." As they turned to head back down the trail, Thomas took one last look at the sealed cave entrance. Behind those rocks, in the darkness where Margaret had hidden her treasures, the cave remained, empty now of artifacts, but full of meaning. It had become a sacred space, a monument to love and loss, and the enduring human need to be remembered. The forest would keep it safe, just as it had for 80 years. And every year, on the anniversary of the discovery, Thomas would return to pay his respects to two people he'd never met, but who had changed his life forever. Because that's what love does. It changes things. It endures. It matters. Margaret Rose Sullivan and Lieutenant James Michael Sullivan had proven that beyond any doubt. They had existed. They had loved. And thanks to a forest ranger and his dog who happened to be in the right place at the right time, they would never, ever be forgotten. As Thomas and Scout disappeared down the trail, the forest settled into its ancient rhythms. Birds sang their evening songs. Squirrels gathered acorns for winter. The wind whispered through the pines. And in a small alcove near a sealed cave, a photograph of two young lovers on their wedding day watched over the woods they had once walked together, their smiles eternal, their love preserved not just in artifacts and letters, but in the hearts of everyone who had heard their story. The sun set over Whispering Pines National Park, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Another day ended, but the story, Margaret and James's story, the story of love conquering time, would continue. It would continue because Thomas McCarthy had found a hidden cave and kept a promise. It would continue because Patricia Bradshaw and her family would pass it down through generations. It would continue because thousands of visitors would stand before an exhibit and remember that every life has meaning, every love story matters, and the simple act of remembering is one of the most powerful things humans can do. In the darkness of the cave, empty now but still sacred, Margaret Rose Sullivan's words remained etched in the limestone. Here lies our love, our dreams, our future. If you find this, please tell our story. Don't let us be forgotten. Someone had found it. Their story had been told. They would never be forgotten. The promise had been kept, dedicated to all the Margaret Roses and Jameses of the world, those whose love stories were cut short by war, disease, or circumstance, but whose love remains eternal. May we never forget.